So we know that in 1808, after Thomas Jefferson has served 2 terms, we're going to see the next election. Jefferson will, of course, follow in Washington's footsteps. He will take take his leave after just 2 terms in office. So then James Madison will become the next president of the United States, defeating Pinckney 122 electoral votes to 47. But so then what's going to happen next? Well, the first thing is that problems with the British are going to increase pretty quickly. And although Jefferson's embargo had been pretty disastrous, especially for whom? Well, yes, the Americans. Especially for the Federalists in New England, right? Merchants, people who make their living in commerce. The embargo had been really terrible. So Madison presides over Jefferson helps to end or to repeal, but Madison will preside over the end of the repeal of the embargo. But we still haven't solved the problem, right? Repealing the embargo doesn't get rid of the French and British aggression against American ships. So they're going to try a few more options. There's the Non-Intercourse Act, which is basically like, we're going to trade with everybody but Britain and France. So remember, the embargo said Americans will not trade internationally at all, right? Keep American ships at home to help protect them from British and French aggression. But that was a terrible idea. So then the Non-Intercourse Act says we'll trade with everybody but Britain and France. But that doesn't work very well because, again, who needs who more? The Americans need the British and the British and the French need us. We need them way more than they need us. So that doesn't work. So then my favorite is Macon's Bill number 2. Someone asked me this morning, what's Macon's Bill number 1? I have no idea. But Macon's Bill number 2 is sort of a combination carrot and stick method. It says we're not going to trade with either Britain and France until one of them will sign a treaty resolving these issues with us. And then whoever signs the treaty with us will trade with them and will continue to not trade with the other. So it's like, hey, Britain, you know how you hate France so much? You want to make sure that France doesn't get access to our goods? How about you sign a treaty with us, and then we'll trade with you, and France will still be shut out of the deal. I think we're sort of pretty overly confident about how important other people think our trade is. But in any case, the British jump on the deal. They go, absolutely, we'll totally sign that treaty. And then what do? Completely ignore it. So they sign the treaty. We begin trading again with them. And so we stop trading. We maintain our avoidance of trade with the French. But the British don't actually do what we ask them to do. They don't protect their rights. They continue with impressments. They continue seizing American goods that are being tried to give to France. Anyway, it gets pretty rough. So then as things heat up on the frontier, right, Tecumseh is once again going to lead a new confederation of Native Americans. This time, we're going to see William Henry Harrison, who will lead a force of Americans and defeat the Native American Confederation, as well as Tecumseh. William Henry Harrison will become a war hero. He's going to run for president later, and his slogan is my very favorite in the whole wide world, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Anyway, that's the Battle of Tippecanoe in which that happens. But the Americans are going to see a British hand in these Native American conflicts. Again, it's not really clear that the British were actually inciting Native Americans to violence, but it's definitely true that the British have not left their forts in the Ohio River Valley. 20 years after the Revolution was concluded, they still haven't left all of their forts in and around the Ohio River and the Great Lakes. And it is true that they're they're trading with Native Americans, weapons, ammunition, and so on. So the Americans feel like it's the British's fault that we're having these conflicts. So those conflicts, together with the cry of the war hawks that we need a war to help improve our national honor, that war is going to be the best way to expand America, will give us a shot at Canada. War will then sort of be repeatedly brought up before Congress. But James Madison, the president, is a bit cautious. He doesn't want to throw all of his support behind the war just yet. He's not necessarily opposed to it, but he's not sure what to do. So they wait through an election cycle. And then in the election of 1812, you can see how it turns out. First of all, what do you notice? The first Clinton. Yeah, okay, not that. Party-wise? They're both Republicans, right? The Federalist Party is pretty weak at this point. Remember, demographically, who the Federalists are, merchants, business owners, bankers, and so on. There's not that many of them. Demographically, the Democratic Republican Party is going to have lots more people to support them. So the Federalists are pretty weak here. They don't even successfully get their own candidate. They're going to support this guy Clinton, not Bill Clinton, he's not that old. They're going to support Clinton, who is a Republican, but is firmly opposed to the war, right? It's pretty much the only thing he agrees the Federalists on, but the Federalists see that as enough, and they endorse him and say, Federalists will vote for this guy. Anyway, but Madison is going to win a fairly significant electoral victory here, and that's all the support or all the information that he needs. He then will support the Congress when they declare war against Great Britain, and so the War of 1812 will begin. But it's kind of funny to think about how you might prosecute a war based on this Democratic Republican ideology. The Democratic Republicans, of course, believe in small government, right? And a relatively weaker national government, at least as compared to their Federalist peers. The Democratic Republicans are going to believe that we need to avoid debt and keep taxes low to protect the agrarian portions of our society. Anybody ever tried to win a war with no debt and no taxes and no strong central power? It doesn't work particularly well, and the War of 1812 doesn't go very well for us. First of all, they don't raise taxes, which means that they're going to have a hard time supplying the army. Madison doesn't want to build up this large national army because, of course, that would require more taxes, it would require debt, and so on and so forth. And so although we do have a U.S. army, it's really small, and so most of the war is going to be fought by individual state militias, which of course aren't coordinated with one another and don't have the same kinds of resources the national government would have. It's pretty rough overall, and in fact the British kick our butts about 100 bazillion times. One of the most embarrassing parts of the war is when the British marched through Washington, D.C. and burned down the Capitol, including the newly constructed White House. In fact, the reason it's called the White House is because after the War of 1812 is when, to cover up these deep soot marks, they had this super bright white paint that they used to paint over it all, and so it was dazzlingly white in the sun, this new iteration. So anyway, otherwise, the British are going to make inroads in the south, where they take several key ports. They're going to sort of threaten the northeast. Amidst all of this chaos, the remaining Federalist leaders are going to get together in Connecticut, right? Most Federalists live in New England. They're going to meet together at what was called the Hartford Convention in Connecticut, where they're going to discuss what they should do. And it looks to everybody like the Americans are going to lose this war. The British are doing way better. The only American success, ironically enough, is coming on the Great Lakes, where we fight some naval battles successfully. You're going in Navy on the Great Lakes. It's because the British had these gigantic, super awesome warships, but the Great Lakes aren't nearly as large as the open ocean, not quite as deep. They can't maneuver nearly as well. And the Americans were using a flotilla of former shipping boats and stuff, and so they were smaller and nimbler and able to sort of sneak in and out. Anyway, the Hartford Convention, the Federalists, they're pretty sure that we're going to lose this war, and they don't want to get sort of dragged down with the rest of the country, and so they began to work on a series of resolutions. The most sort of dramatic of which was a resolution that would allow for New England to secede from the rest of the United States, so that they wouldn't be defeated along with the rest of the country by Great Britain, and they could maintain independent nation status. Now, luckily for them, I guess, they don't formally vote on those resolutions. If they had, they probably would have been accused and arrested for treason. But they don't vote on that final piece or they don't call for a vote until later. And before they come back for the final vote, word arrives that the war is in fact over. So they don't actually commit treason; they just talk about it real hard. So the war, ends. But what do you think is going to be the future of the Federalist Party after that? None is a good answer, right? They don't have a future. They were already weak, right? Remember, the election of 1812, the Federalists already can't even run their own candidate. So it's not like they were doing super well before this. But the fact that they had sided with the British and had potentially or were about to commit treason really looks bad when the whole country is going to celebrate its victory in the War of 1812. Now, when you write down the word victory, will you please make sure to put quotation marks around it? Because we didn't really win much or anything at all in the War of 1812. But because the British come and attack us and then they leave again, we're going to claim it as a victory because America. And it's going to do good for our nation building, but anyway, we don't win much. Last thing, so around about 1814, the British begin to realize that despite the fact that they are absolutely owning the Americans on pretty much every battlefield, they have way bigger fish to fry. They don't actually want to take over the United States anymore. Like, they have other more valuable colonies that don't cause nearly as much trouble as we do. And they're, of course, again, involved in conflict with the French. They're worried about the Spanish, who have begun to threaten a war of their own. And so the British decide to sue for peace just to make us go away, you know? And so the peace treaty, or the peace convention, will open in Ghent, which is in Belgium. It's one of the only non-Treaty of Parises that there are in U.S. history. So it will open in Ghent, and then they'll begin to come to a resolution. Yes? 1814? Ghent? 1814. So at Ghent, they begin to negotiate, and they finally decide on the sort of the terms of the peace treaty, which basically simply restores the status quo. The British don't agree to anything. They're not going to necessarily end impressments, although they eventually will end impressments because the French are going to be defeated and they don't need them anymore. They don't agree to stop supplying Native Americans in and around the Great Lakes. They sort of agree they're going to leave their forts in the Great Lakes and Ohio River Valley region, but they said that before, so there's no enforcement mechanism there. Really, all the Treaty of Ghent does is just stop the fighting. Nothing is really solved by this treaty, but the Americans obviously weren't going to get much better out of the deal, so they're going to accept that. Meanwhile, as news about the treaty's resolution sort of makes its way slowly across the ocean, this guy, Andrew Jackson, is going to become the hero in what will become the final battle of the war. Although it's interesting to point out that the war was already over, technically, when the battle occurs. They just didn't know it yet because the treaty's news hadn't arrived. But so what happens is the British, who also don't know that the war is over yet, begin to gather reinforcements for a concerted attack on the port of New Orleans. The hope being that if they captured New Orleans, assuming the war continued, that they'd be able to keep the colonists from transferring important supplies out of the Great Lakes region and sort of like allow the British to be more successful on the eastern seaboard. Anyway, they're going to try to take New Orleans, and so Jackson, who at the time was in Mississippi with sort of the remnants of his army, marches sort of at double time to meet this threat that he knows is coming. Along the way, he basically drafts anyone he can find, including some slaves and free black Americans, which is a bit controversial at the time. He sort of inspires them with his, like, I'm not going to take poop from anybody attitude, gathers them all. They make these sort of like creative entrenchment where they like are in places the British wouldn't expect them to be. And when the British attack, they almost miraculously push back this British offensive. They defend the city of New Orleans. They're able to keep it. And Jackson is quickly going to become a war hero for this role. Now, his enemies used to always tease him and say, like, you got your heroism from a war, from a battle that didn't need to be fought. The war was already over. But I'd like to point out that let's say Jackson hadn't won the Battle of New Orleans, and the British captured the city, and then news arrived that the treaty had been signed and the war was over. Even if that was true, do you think the British would have given back New Orleans? At least not without more of a fight, or without trying to exact more concessions from the Americans, right? So I am definitely not a Jackson fan, but there is value to the victory of New Orleans. Even if the war was over, the British could still have reopened hostilities or chosen not to leave New Orleans or whatever if they had really wanted to. So that's sort of the end of our story there. And what we're going to look at now is what comes next. So you have some documents in front of you, and we're going to look at this beginning of what was called the Era of Good Feelings.